Can the Baltimore Ravens bounce back in Week 13 against the Denver Broncos? We talk about key players, key matchups, key storylines, and more on a crossover Thursday next year on Locked On Ravens.
You are Locked On Ravens, your daily Baltimore Ravens podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And we return here with another episode of Locked On Ravens, your daily Baltimore Ravens podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Ostraker of Ravens Wire. And of course, we're here on the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you so much for tuning in with us, making us your first listen of the day. We're free and available on all platforms, including on YouTube. So if you heard us on YouTube, be sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel. Also, be sure to follow us anywhere you get your podcast, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify. We're daily, 5 days a week Ravens content. So any Ravens news, analysis, updates, and more, we have it here for you on Locked On Ravens. Here today, though, we're going to be diving into a crossover Thursday with Sayre Bedinger of Locked On Broncos, talking about the key storylines, key matchups, and more for this game. Really important game for Baltimore. Actually, a pretty important game for Denver, too, just in terms of finding something for them. So we'll talk about that today. Also, the big news on Wednesday is apparently, reportedly, the Ravens offensive coordinator, Greg Roman, has been talking with Stanford about their open vacant head coach position. So we'll see. John Harbaugh confirmed those reports, said it was very preliminary. But hey, after putting on a Greg Roman show yesterday, I guess I spoke it into existence or something that we get some Greg Roman news. So again, nothing confirmed nearly yet. Again, very preliminary. There's a chance he doesn't even get the job. So just a bit of Ravens news coming out of Wednesday here on Thursday. But without any further ado, let's dive into crossover Thursday with Sayre Bedinger of Locked On Broncos. Welcome into a crossover edition of both Locked On Ravens and Locked On Broncos. I'm Kevin Ostraker from Locked On Ravens. He's Sayre Bedinger of Locked On Broncos. We're here on the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day, and thank you so much for tuning in and making us your first listen of the day. We're free and available on all platforms, including over on YouTube. And today's episode of both Locked On Ravens and Locked On Broncos is brought to you by PrizePicks. PrizePicks is daily fantasy made easy. Just pick 2 to 5 players, and if they score more or less than their PrizePicks projection, you go up to 10 times money on your entry. First time users are going to receive an instant deposit match up to $100 with promo code Locked On. That's PrizePicks.com. Promo code Locked On. And Sayre, we have a Week 13 matchup here. Ravens and Broncos. I know for people in Denver, you might just want to hear us talk about the Nuggets for 30 minutes because they're doing well. I'm a huge Nuggets guy myself here in Baltimore, so a big shout out to Locked On Nuggets, the boys, and Matt Moore and Adam Morris over there. But we have a football game going on, and this is a team in the Ravens that lost a pretty heartbreaking one to Jacksonville in Week 12. Denver's been reeling for most of the season. They're trying to get back on track here. For you, Sayre, what's the biggest storyline heading into this game for a 3-8 football team in the Broncos?
Oh, man. Well, first of all, Kevin, it's great to see you as always. I know we've got a chance to chat quite a bit over the last couple of years here since I've been on. And I mean, Week 13, we're already here. It's kind of crazy to think about. I think that at this point, you and I had talked maybe, I don't know if it was close to the start of the season or if it was after Russell Wilson's extension, but I remember just kind of talking to you off the air about, man, we're looking forward to potential, playoff implications in that Ravens-Broncos matchup in Week 13. Here we are, and the biggest storyline, I think, for the Denver Broncos, I don't know if you could necessarily pick one, but I'll pick kind of the one that I would say I've been kind of picking on almost every one of these crossover episodes, and it's really that, man, Russell Wilson and the offense have got to figure out a way to get something going. There's a lot of unrest in Broncos country right now regarding head coach Nathaniel Hackett. Obviously, Russell Wilson, the $245 million man who so far, I mean, I think he's got 8 touchdown passes and 12 bathrooms in his house is the joke that people are saying right now on social media. It's like he's got more bathrooms than he has touchdown passes through 12 weeks. But really, the disconnect between Hackett and Wilson has led to the lowest scoring offense in the NFL since the year 2000. And I honestly, I mean, it's just kind of crazy to think, like you and I were talking before the show, our worst expectations from Broncos country did not even come close to this. I mean, this is worse than the worst. This is you digging holes at rock bottom, finding ways through and finding ways further down. It's really about whether or not the offense can figure something out. I put a poll out there on my Twitter account this week, Kevin, to say like, hey, Broncos country, if the offense could kind of get things going over these next 6 weeks and just start tearing it up, would you be okay keeping Nathaniel Hackett around? Because for the longest time, it's been, well, we'd rather just fire Hackett, get a reset, find somebody else that can work with Russell Wilson. So that was the first option I chose. Or would you rather the team keep on, struggling offensively and fire Hackett and find a new coach? 70% of the people that voted on this poll, Kevin, said that they would rather the offense figure it out and keep Hackett. They'd rather keep Hackett around at the, if it means the Broncos turning things around offensively, then move on from Hackett and have the offense keep struggling. So I think, long story short, roundabout way to say the biggest storyline for the Broncos this week is, can the offense get things going? Can they even look competent? Because through 12 weeks this season, they really haven't.
Right. And I know for the Ravens, their offense has struggled coming out of the bye. There were a lot of promising signs going into it. You had the second half of the Tampa game in prime time where they struggled in that first half, but then they came out, they ran the ball with a vengeance. Then they go week 9 against New Orleans, and they have their most dominant wire-to-wire win of the season there. People are feeling good about the offense heading into the bye. And this team has been getting back a lot of guys throughout the season because they obviously lost so many people last season to injuries. J.K. Dobbins, Gus Edwards, Marcus Peters, the list goes on and on and on. They've been getting guys back throughout the season, and it's been a theme here where the Ravens in practice on Wednesday, J.K. Dobbins returned to practice and his 21-day window opened up. I wouldn't anticipate him playing against Denver just because they probably want to ramp him up a little bit more, but Marcus Williams has been practicing. Isaiah Likely returned to practice. Ronnie Stanley and Kyle Hamilton, who both missed week 12, both returned to practice here on Wednesday for week 13. But for an offense that has really had two, and slow starts happen in the NFL on offense, right? Sometimes offenses take a little bit to get acclimated to the game, get acclimated to game flow. The Ravens, over the course of these last 2 weeks, their slow starts have lasted 3+ quarters. And that can't happen in the NFL against any team. The Ravens, they are able to have that dominant defensive performance in week 11 against Carolina. But week 12, Jacksonville just took it to the defense in the fourth quarter. And so that offense, it was a joint effort all around. Now, it's funny because I think the biggest storyline for Wednesday in Baltimore is the whole Greg Roman thing. I actually put out a show on Wednesday saying, should the Ravens move on from Greg Roman? Is it time for the Ravens to move on from Greg Roman? Well, the news on Wednesday was that Roman has been talking with Stanford for their potential head coaching vacancy. So John Harbaugh confirmed those reports, saying that it's very preliminary at this point. So we don't know what's going to happen there in Baltimore. But I know for an offense that has been at the top of the league in rushing for so many years now, their pass offense has been kind of middling outside of that 2019 season. There have been play calling issues, execution issues as well. People are looking for answers in Baltimore overall, but I think getting guys back helps. Getting an all-pro tackle and Ronnie Stanley back helps. Getting J.K. Dobbins, who's been a phenomenal player over his first 2 years, helps, or 1 year plus helps. But for Denver, Sayre, what's the injury situation looking like right now?
Well, right now you got a couple of guys that Russell Wilson throws the ball to that still haven't been able to stay healthy and string together any number of games. I mean, Jerry Jeudy, he's missed the last couple of weeks with an ankle injury. KJ Hamler, he missed some time early on this season with a flare-up of his knee injury from last season, and then now he's got the hamstring, which he came into the NFL coming out of Penn State with hamstring issues, and they have just plagued him for the last 3+ years. So those are lingering issues and injuries for the Broncos to kind of keep an eye out for. There's really nobody else on this team. I mean, there's been tons of injuries, players injured all throughout the season. I mean, you just never know who you're going to get on a week-to-week basis for the Denver Broncos, it seems like, at this point. But right now, the primary injuries are on the offensive side of the ball, the supporting cast for Russell Wilson, constantly reshuffling that offensive line, constantly changing guys in and out at wide receiver, tight end, the running back position. Obviously, Ravens fans will know Latavius Murray very well. There's no Javonte Williams. There's no Melvin Gordon. He was cut. And there's no Mike Boone, at least as far as we know right now. He did return to practice, though, on Wednesday. Mike Boone, another guy that I think probably nobody's really heard of, because why would you hear about Mike Boone? He's the number 3 running back in Denver and a special teams guy, but he could end up playing a big role alongside former Raven Latavius Murray in the Broncos backfield this weekend due to all those injuries on the offensive side of the ball.
Yeah, and I think one of my bigger storylines, and it's kind of an underrated one. You talked about Latavius Murray, a revenge game of sorts, but what about that Jerry Rosburg revenge game? He's been calling play on the sidelines for Denver. What's his role been like in Denver since he's been there?
Yeah, so really early in the season, there were a lot of people talking about the fact that Nathaniel Hackett struggled to manage the game, right? Struggling to manage the clock, calling timeouts at the right or the wrong time, and really struggling just overall with game management, being that he's the offensive play caller, which he's not anymore. That's now Clint Kubiak. But at the time, that was why Jerry Rosburg came in, was to be that game manager, to be the guy that say, okay, we need to challenge this play. We need to call a timeout here. This is how we're going to manage the clock in the 2 minute. I don't necessarily know exactly to what degree he handles that. I don't know if that's completely off Nathaniel Hackett's plate and on Jerry Rosburg, or if he's just consulting. Maybe he has the final say. I don't know exactly how that works, but I know that since he's come in, that aspect has stabilized a little bit. If nothing else, we've seen a couple of nice, the Broncos managing the clock in a 2-minute situation, or trying to get the ball back to the offense with the defense getting the stop at the end of a half. Different things like that. We've seen improvement there. So something definitely, I know John Harbaugh talked about his respect for Jerry Rosburg, and it's cool to kind of see all those different things coming together. But yeah, it's been one of those years for the Broncos where one thing on top of another, and really game management had been early on in the season, at least, a huge problem that Jerry Rosburg came in to fix.
Yeah, so maybe not calling the plays, but helping calling the shots for this Denver team. And I know Tim Patrick, and we're not going to get a revenge game there. He's been out for the season, and that was an unfortunate blow for Denver early on in the year. And then we could have potentially had a Derek Wolfe revenge game, Ravens-wise, but that whole situation was very weird throughout the offseason. He obviously goes back to Denver, retires as a Bronco. But coming up in our second segment, we'll be diving into key matchups for this game. A big Week 13 one between the Ravens and the Broncos. So be sure to stay tuned. Still a ton to talk about here on both Locked On Ravens and Locked On Broncos. But first, I do want to tell you a bit about Audible. This episode is brought to you by Audible. Audible is releasing a slate of new football podcasts that we're sure you're going to love. Find Think Like a Champion now wherever you get your podcasts. Think Like a Champion is a brand new podcast from Russell Wilson and Audible. Russ is a champion on the field, but off of it, we rarely know the grind on the path to greatness. Russell Wilson alongside co-host Harry Wilson and the late Trevor Moore dig into how high-performance athletes, artists, and leaders push the boundaries of their potential. Head over to Locked On Presents for a sneak peek of Think Like a Champion, or catch the full series available anywhere you get your podcasts, available everywhere now. Audible, get in the game. We return our second segment of both Locked On Ravens and Locked On Broncos. Kevin Oestreicher of Locked On Ravens, Sayre Bedinger of Locked On Broncos. And Sayre, for this one, I have a couple matchups I've been circling and keeping my eye on, and I'm definitely going to be watching throughout the game on Sunday. My first one, and I'll throw it to you to kind of get your thoughts on it. I think Marlon Humphrey versus Courtland Sutton. I'm going to say Sutton for now, depending on what happens with Jerry Jeudy throughout the week, whether he plays or not. But this is a matchup where we rarely see these shadow games in the NFL anymore, where we see a corner go with the wide receiver everywhere, every single snap. But those two, if Jerry Jeudy's out, Courtland Sutton is by far the number one receiver on that Denver offense. Marlon Humphrey has had a bounce back year in 2022. He is by far their most reliable option at corner, especially with some of the struggles we've seen from Marcus Peters. How important is that matchup?
Well, it's going to be huge. I mean, one of the things that really has been a disappointment in a season full of disappointments for the Denver Broncos has really been, like you mentioned in the previous segment, losing Tim Patrick. I think nobody really mentions him. You're the first person to bring him up in our crossover, segments that we've done. But Tim Patrick, that loss was absolutely humongous because it put so much pressure on Courtland Sutton. Not that Jerry Jeudy's a bad player. In fact, I think Jerry Jeudy has been the Broncos' best receiver this season. But what's been really disappointing, Courtland Sutton has not, up to this point, really reestablished himself. Remember back in 2019, he's making all those crazy circus catches in Broncos country. People are calling him QB proof, it was Brandon Allen, Joe Flacco, Drew Lock throwing him passes back then. He hasn't been that guy by any means. I mean, he made some plays the last couple of weeks, but really, he leads the team in drops. He's got a very high drop percentage this year. He hasn't been a go-to guy in the red zone. And frankly, that's part of the reason why I think the Broncos have struggled there. So Marlon Humphrey, going up against him, shadowing him, that wouldn't surprise me, because that's going to put other guys into play, like more guys that probably Ravens fans may be hearing their names for the very first time, other than maybe Kendall Hinton, Brandon Johnson, Jalen Virgil, Montrell Washington. Those are the guys that have been, out there on the field running routes for Russell Wilson. And if Courtland Sutton isn't a factor, which he hasn't, he has been, but he hasn't been, if that makes sense. He hasn't been a wide receiver one type of guy for the Denver Broncos. If he can do that against Marlon Humphrey, that's going to be huge for this matchup in terms of the Broncos finding some offensive success.
Yeah, and I want to flip the script and talk a bit about Denver's pass defense going up against the Ravens' pass offense. Now, Denver's pass defense, you look at the stats, and they are a top 5 unit. In fact, they are a top 3 unit in net yards per attempt, giving up 5.1 on the season. For Baltimore's pass offense right now, they're in the middle. They're 17th right now, but have definitely struggled to find overall consistency. I mean, the first 3 weeks of the year for the Ravens offense, Lamar Jackson was at the top of the MVP conversation, putting up insane box score stats. And it doesn't all come back to the box score. Like, there is so much more that goes into a performance than just passing yards and passing touchdowns and completions. But we have seen struggles. Rashad Bateman is out for the year. He suffered a Lisfranc injury, had to have surgery on his foot. So now the de facto number one guy in Baltimore wide receiver wise is Devin Duvernay. Now, the number one pass catcher is Mark Andrews. That's not going to change. He is one of the best, if not the best tight ends in the league right now. But how do you look at this pass defense for Denver, Sayre, and their matchup that they have with this Baltimore receiving core? That you mentioned Denver not necessarily having a ton of household names. Baltimore's kind of the same way right now.
Yeah, it's something that I think you're obviously going to get a healthy dose of Pat Surtain, just like you mentioned Marlon Humphrey on the other side. Pat Surtain has been that guy for the Denver Broncos. Now, he's got a couple of receivers, a couple of good receivers the last couple of weeks have got the better of him, namely Devontae Adams of the Raiders 2 weeks ago, and then DJ Moore this past weekend of the Panthers. Had a couple really of the first big plays that we've seen given up by Pat Surtain all year. And it kind of just feels like the entire pass defense has fed off of just, I don't know if you could say it's his energy or whatever he's doing, that teams, they can't throw at Pat Surtain consistently up until the last couple of weeks when, Sam Darnold tested him of all people, and Derek Carr the week before that, just because the Raiders offense by design is designed to flow through Devontae Adams. But Pat Surtain is a guy that I'll be interested to see in this matchup against the Ravens. Will he follow around a guy like Mark Andrews? Because we haven't really seen the Broncos do that in terms of matching up Pat Surtain against a tight end before. But like you said, Andrews is that number one guy for the Ravens. So will they try that? Ejiro Evera has been nothing if not creative in terms of the way that he's gone about pass defense this year. He's been really creative in terms of the pass rush, which I think has helped a lot. I know the Broncos don't have like a premier sack guy right now with the Bradley Chubb trade taking place. So off the edge, they just bring heat, and they not necessarily closing in on the quarterback every single time they bring heat, but they're bringing pressure in such unique and creative ways that it's causing quarterbacks to just be off the mark ever so slightly. And frankly, the defensive backs are playing very well. It's been a group effort, though. One of the injuries that obviously right now has affected that pass defense, K'Waun Williams, the slot corner, he has been out for the last couple of weeks. He's got a couple of injuries that he's been dealing with, but he was such a key player for that pass defense. And the last couple of weeks, as we've seen the Broncos pass defense kind of go down just a little bit in terms of its overall efficiency, giving up big plays to the Panthers and the Raiders. Wouldn't surprise me if the Ravens try to kind of attack that area, just because the Broncos are down a couple of guys there and they've given up some big plays the last couple of weeks.
And you mentioned the sacks for Denver. The sacks for Baltimore have been coming in bunches this year. They are currently tied for 5th in the league in sacks with 35. A lot of that has to do with Justin Houston, who is very quickly approaching double digits. He has had a resurgence this year in a big way. Dafe Owe has struggled for them in his second season, definitely a sophomore slump for him. But this is a team in Denver where I know there's been a lot of talk about that offensive line. I think a big matchup here is going to be the Ravens pass rush going up against that Denver offensive line. How's that been this year for Denver, the offensive line?
It's been bad. I mean, I think there's a lot of misleading stats out there that talk about Russell Wilson's time to throw. And yeah, I think it's kind of a collective group effort, right? I mean, you do have, if you have more time to throw, obviously the quarterback is responsible for some of the sacks, but Russell Wilson has been sacked a lot this year. I think he's on pace for 53, I think is what I read, is what he's on pace for at this point. And man, it's been tough to watch because it's momentum killing. The offensive line has been a problem in a variety of ways, whether you're talking about holding penalties, whether you're talking about pre-snap penalties. I mean, I don't think anybody has struggled more with Russell Wilson's hard count than Quinn Miners, the right guard for the Broncos, who, I mean, frankly, he's been the team's best offensive lineman. So you kind of just throw your hands in the air. He's got a bunch of false starts this year because of Russell Wilson's hard count. And you're getting into all these difficult situations. And with Russ, you can just tell he doesn't feel like he can trust that offensive line. So right now, it's kind of just a revolving door at a variety of positions. Left tackle Garrett Bowles, he's out for the year. So it's Calvin Anderson out there at left tackle. Starting center Lloyd Cushenberry, he's out. So you've got veteran guard Graham Glasgow moving inside to the center position. And then at right tackle, you've got Cam Fleming because Billy Turner is injured. And it's just not been good. I mean, you know, offensive line, they need chemistry, they need time to gel. And not that you can't, interchange guys at times in the NFL, but for the Denver Broncos, it's been so tough because they can't find any sort of consistency. And I think it's affected Russell Wilson's ability to, that internal clock where he's thinking, okay, maybe I've got a half second more, or maybe I need to go a half second quicker. It's affecting his timing so badly that the Broncos can't find really any success in the quick passing game. If they want to drop back and do the deep passing game. I mean, this past weekend, we saw Brian Burns. He won the NFC Defensive Player of the Week against the Denver Broncos. I mean, I'm not saying I'm predicting right now Justin Houston going to be the AFC Defensive Player of the Week, but man, if he's not a favorite for it at this point, he probably should be. Maybe lay like $10 on that, Kevin, when you get a chance. But it's just kind of the way things have been going for the Denver Broncos in terms of these matchups. They just can't win one or the other. They can't figure one thing out and have another thing succeed. Like if the offense did play well, it would then be the receivers dropping passes. It's just that domino effect right now for the team. And that matchup on the offensive line going up against a team that's top 5 in sacks. I mean, Russell Wilson better be ready to run.
Yeah, it would be great if Justin Houston, for Baltimore's sake, would be able to get some sacks under his belt here, continue his trek in terms. He's hit the fountain of youth this year. He's been great. We've also seen effective corner blitzes by Mike McDonald in his defense. Marlon Humphrey sacked in back-to-back weeks, I believe. So there's a lot to like about this Ravens pass rush right now, but it has to be consistent. It can't be in flurries where, you get 3 sacks on 2 possessions and you don't see anything for the rest of the game. They have struggled a little bit with that. But with the transition from Don Martindale to Matt McDonald, we've seen a bit more pressure with 4. That struggled. That was a big struggle for Baltimore last season. So we'll see. We'll see if Russell Wilson and that Denver offense can respond to Justin Houston and that Baltimore pass rush. Coming up here, though, I'll be diving into our final predictions, wrapping up this crossover here for Locked On Ravens and Locked On Broncos. So be sure to stay tuned. Still a ton to talk about. But first, this episode is sponsored by BetOnline, and Sayre talked a bit about putting some money on that Justin Houston prop. Maybe if you want to do that, BetOnline is the place for you. BetOnline.net is your number one source for sports betting info, stats, news, and analysis. You can get the latest odds and trends for every professional and amateur league out there, from football to basketball. You have soccer and esports. They've got it all over at BetOnline.net. And if you love sports podcasts, you can find those at BetOnline as well. They're always the fastest and easiest way to get your betting fix. So head over to the website today, use your mobile device to learn more. BetOnline, where the game starts. We're back. We're rounding out Locked On Ravens and Locked On Broncos here on Crossover Thursday. Kevin Allstriker still here with Sayre Bedinger. And Sayre, for this game, I think it's big for both teams in different ways. For the Ravens, they're still in the thick of the playoff hunt. They are tied with Cincinnati at the top of the AFC North. Now they do have the tiebreaker right now. But for Denver, this is a team that's just looking for answers, and any bit of momentum, even if it's not for this year, even you can build upon that for future years with Russell Wilson at the helm, with a Nathaniel Hackett still as a head coach, and whatever the future holds for Denver. It's big to get a win against maybe a team like Baltimore. And for Baltimore, it's big to get a win over a team like Denver just to get some momentum back. So when you look at this game and you look at the matchups and the storylines we've talked about, how do you see this one going?
Well, here's a couple of things that I know to be true. Number one, the Broncos pretty historically struggle against the Baltimore Ravens. I believe they're 9-6 overall against the, or 6-9. Sorry, the Ravens are 9-6 against the Broncos. They struggle against the Ravens. They typically struggle against the AFC North for whatever reason. And number three, they very much struggle in that early window, that 1 o'clock Eastern time window. The Broncos, for whatever reason, struggle. And I think a lot of it has to do with just their style of play. The AFC North, typically very physical. The Broncos, not necessarily as physical of a team, and especially when they're beat up like they are. So they kind of struggle in that way. And I think that this is a game that, here's what my head thinks, Kevin. My head says that the Broncos are going to lose this game by 10 points or more and probably have the same types of struggles that they've had all season. But anytime I do these predictions, I always try to manifest something, right? So we got to manifest positivity. I want to see the Broncos score 24 points in a victory. I mean, not necessarily, I don't know. I mean, that would be basically doubling their season average per game. I mean, they're at 14 points per game. That would almost be double of where they're at. But look, they've had some games where the offense has started to click a little bit, and they, for whatever reason, just can't cash in the red zone. Maybe this could be a week where Russell Wilson figures some things out offensively. The Broncos offense scores 24 points. Maybe they come away and steal a victory, get some momentum back, like you said. But what my head is telling me is that this team maybe will score 16 or 17 points and lose by 10.
I think this is a Baltimore win. I think for what you have, the Ravens are in a key stretch of their schedule right now where all the talk coming out of the bye for Baltimore was how easy their schedule was. Now, there's no easy game in the NFL, right? Any team is going to play you tough any given week. It's any given Sunday. But against Carolina, it was interesting for the first three quarters. There were only field goals. Then Baltimore was able to put the game away. Jacksonville, they played with their food a bit too much, it looked like. Jacksonville also is better than their record right now. They've lost a bunch of close games. So the Ravens end up losing that one on a 2-point conversion. I mean, how fitting it was based off how last year Baltimore lost all those games on those failed 2-point conversions. Now they lose a game because the opposing team does it to them on a situation where they could tie. But regardless, I think there is always talk about bounce back games and this is a good situation for a bounce back game. I think this is the perfect opportunity for a bounce back game. Denver's been reeling all season. They're going to be looking for momentum, as I talked about. But for an offense like this, I think this is where they figure out their red zone struggles. I'm hopeful. You talked about the red zone a bit there, Sayre. The Ravens over the past 3 weeks have been abysmal in the red zone. They're 29th in red zone offense, converting touchdowns to just a 38.46% rate. Baltimore goes 2 of 5 in the red zone against Jacksonville in week 12. You're leaving 12 points on the board in a 1-point loss. Just one of those is a score, and the Ravens win that game. So I think for the way that this Ravens run offense has looked this season, if you can feed through that, if you can feed through Gus Edwards and Kenyon Drake, and hopefully we see a better offensive line performance than we saw in week 12, I think that Baltimore can out-physical Denver. And if you can sprinkle in the pass offense there, because, testing Pat Surtain can be difficult because he's one of the best in the league, definitely. But I do think that the Ravens have enough juice on offense against a Denver team that has struggled on offense. That Denver can maybe do one or two things here and there, especially with what we saw in the fourth quarter. But Baltimore's offense outside of that has fed off of their defense. I mean, the defense has sparked their offense over these past couple of weeks with key turnovers. So I'm thinking that Denver is able to score points, but maybe I'm in that 17-20 range. You were in that 16 area. I'll say this is a 28-20 Ravens win, and maybe a game where the Broncos get a late touchdown or a late field goal. I'm not going to say pure blowout, but I will say this is a win that maybe gets Baltimore season back on track, and they need it, because if they lose this one, maybe we see something like a Cam Cameron firing. We saw that Cam Cameron firing in 2012 when the Ravens were 9-4, but they were on a 2-game losing streak. And what happens after that? Baltimore goes on and they win the Super Bowl. So maybe they need a spark there. Maybe it could be a firing from Greg Roman. Who knows? But especially after that Stanford talk, who really knows at this point? But I think that this will be a better game than people think it will be. But I still think Baltimore comes out on top. And I think that it will be a big spark to Baltimore's season. And maybe Denver can find some answers in it too.
And if they can, that would be awesome. If they don't, I think it's going to be a lot more of what we've seen, which is Broncos country raging on Twitter, people calling for heads to roll, and probably rightfully so, just because you got to have the right combination. The Broncos, I mean, they're tied, I think, or going to be soon tied for the longest playoff drought currently in the NFL. So I mean, a loss this weekend would cement another losing season. So I believe that's what, 7 straight or 6 straight since Peyton Manning retired. It's hard to keep track at this point, Kevin. It's been brutal. The years just seem to blend together here. But really, a loss this weekend would push us one step closer to the Broncos probably having a new head coach in the offseason and a lot more questions versus answers when it comes to the $245 million man, Russell Wilson, at QB.
Right. A big game on Sunday for both teams, absolutely, for different reasons, but that does not mean it's not big for either one here. Sayre, I appreciate you. That's all we have here for Crossover Thursday, Locked On Ravens and Locked On Broncos. And look, whenever there's football, it's a good day. And on Sunday, I'm looking forward to a good game between these two teams. Big shout out to Sayre for talking with me about the Ravens and letting me get my little Nuggets plug in there at the beginning. Again, huge Denver Nuggets guy here. So go Nuggets. And also, of course, go Ravens. That's all I have for you here today, though, on Locked On Ravens. When we get back here tomorrow, I'll be previewing the Ravens Week 13 matchup with the Denver Broncos in our full game preview. So be sure to stay tuned for that, and I will see you right back here tomorrow.